Hey, everybody. How are you? If it's Monday, you know what that means. Another edition of Monday School. Bo Prosser here from the Center for Christian Education. Thanks for joining with me, as always, on Monday for Monday School. Today, we are looking at the Smith and Helwys Formation Series lesson outline for November the 12th. The finery of the temple, Second Chronicles 3 through 17. Continuing to look at our historical record of Solomon building the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now, remember, it was David who conceived the idea. It was David who gained the sanction, blessing of God. And it was David who built partnerships with Hiram, who hired thousands of workers and set the plans in place. It was Solomon standing on the shoulders of his father David who implements the plan. And I would remind you today that you and I also stand on the legacies of those who have come before us. There are many people in our lives who have brought us to this place, this present moment. Too many to mention in this 20-minute segment of time. Just know that all of us, as we come into the teaching each week, stand on the shoulders of giants who have paved the way for us. Now, Solomon doesn't begin building until his fourth year. So what was he doing in the first 3 years? He was planning. He was praying. He was gathering resources and building relationships. And as he begins this good work, I imagine that his prayer life probably ramped up another level. I'm sure that his joy was overflowing as they began putting pillars in the ground and foundations in the ground. I know without a doubt that his purpose was strengthened as he began this work, and his devotion not only to the work, but especially to God, was strengthened. Solomon was fulfilling a good work. He was on a mission. I would suggest that you and I might also be on a mission. Prayer and joy and purpose and devotion should also fill us every day as we rise to greet a new day, as we move about our journey each day. I don't know about you, but every day is not a day filled with prayer for me. Every day is not filled with joy for me. There are some days I wonder what in the world I'm about, and my purpose seems unclear, as does my devotion. This lesson reminds me each day to renew my relationship with the living God, that I might be filled with prayer and joy and purpose and devotion. Perhaps you need to hear those words. Perhaps your class needs to hear those words as well. One other thing, God did not need the opulence. God did not say to David, build the most luxurious dwelling place on earth. David wanted to provide that, and Solomon wanted to provide that. Solomon was building the greatest temple to the greatest God. Solomon needed all of the beauty and lavish adornments. God accepts our offerings, whether huge and over the top or whether small and humble. Don't get caught up in the lavishness of the accessories of the temple. God accepted the gift of Solomon's temple. God also accepted the widow's mite. And both stories have lasted for hundreds of years. 1 Kings 5 and 6 offers some other information about this building. It was written about in two different places because David and Solomon represented the golden age of Israel. And why is that important for us? Because these two kings are in a direct lineage of Jesus, and they link us directly to Jesus. So it's important to pay attention, not only for the goodness that they did, but for the goodness that would come from what they did. Solomon builds the greatest temple for the greatest God. Competition for the greatest God was fierce. And so Solomon takes it over the top to give witness to the greatest God. Many adults today appreciate bigger and better and fancier, yet most of our worship spaces are very modest. Appreciating our space and contributing to the beauty of our space are both forms of worshiping God. And regardless of your worship space, God desires our sincere worship, not the adornments of the space. Solomon gave his best. Do we give our best? Again, Solomon wanted this to be the greatest temple for the greatest God. He even enlisted the king of Tyre in doing so. You see, temples were prevalent in Jerusalem. The pagans had as many temples to their gods up and down the streets. Competition for whose God was the greatest was all around the Israelites. And Solomon knows that his God is the greatest God. Yahweh, Jehovah God, had proven throughout history that he, Jehovah God, was the God of all history. Yahweh is the creator of heaven and earth and the King of glory. Therefore, Solomon will not be outdone in building his temple. And it was glorious, over the top, opulent, a spectacle to behold. He builds on Mount Moriah, the same mount where supposedly Abraham offered up Isaac in worship of God. A cubit is something you'll read about in today's passage. A cubit was somewhere between 17 and 21 inches in modern day equivalent measurement. Solomon builds the ceilings 30 to 50 feet tall. The vestibule was somewhere between 20 to 40 feet. Everything was over the top. And why? What was the reason for this? Because Solomon will say, as big and beautiful and awesome as this temple is, God is bigger and better and even more inspiring. Most of us do not worship in places as grand as Solomon's temple. Most of our sanctuaries are not adorned with gold and precious stone. Yet people in the history of your church contributed sacrificially so that the worship space would bring glory and honor to God. People in the current work of your church are contributing to keep the worship space a testimony to the goodness and love of God. How are you contributing? What generous gift do you have to give? How is your church giving witness to the greatness of our God? These are all questions that you might want to wrestle with as you and your class examine this passage. If you want to take a short field trip this week, go to the cornerstone of your sanctuary building. Most every church that I know has a cornerstone set into the bottom base of the building that says when it was built, that maybe has some testimony of faith carved into that stone, maybe even has the building committee that helped build that building. Locate your church's cornerstone and talk about how your church is living out the statement of faith that prompted this laying of a cornerstone. Who are some people that were instrumental in building the building? You may have to go to your church library if you have one and seek out a history of your church. Or you may have to talk to one of the older members of your church to get some background. But whatever you do, do a little historical survey. If you don't, do a prayer walk over to the cornerstone and find out some of the background on your own sanctuary. If you were building a sanctuary for your church today, what would that building look like? Share some visions from class members and then talk about some of the places where you're all thinking the same kinds of things. Are any of your responses as opulent as Solomon's vision? Probably not. However, there are some general characteristics that might relate to Solomon. Lastly, I ask you, where have you seen God at work this week? How have you been touched by God's glory this week? That's a question that I find helpful each week as I come in to study Scripture. So we turn to the grandeur of the house. Solomon is building such a grand building to give testimony to the greatest God ever. And you will be amazed at the grandeur that is described. While some might say the temple was modest at best, the vision of the place and the description from the chronicler is nothing short of awesome. Remember, Solomon didn't even begin building until his 4th year as king. The planning was detailed. The procurement of materials must have been overwhelming. The job site itself would have had to have been huge. The temple was not being built for an assembled congregation. Solomon was not building a 1,000-seat temple. He was building a building that would allow for the coming and going of worshipers from day to night. The Jewish practice of worship was mostly self-guided. You would come into the temple. The women could only go so far into the temple. Children, male children, could go a little bit farther. The ruling men of their homes got to go in deeper into the temple, but only the high priest got to go into the Holy of Holies. So the crowds were not assembling all at once, but there was coming and going and movement, and the temple was a busy place. By the time Jesus was worshiping in the temple, It was, if you will, like a mall. You came into the entrance and you washed yourself clean in baptism pools. You then moved a bit deeper, and the women could only, again, go so far. And then you moved deeper and deeper into the temple. At each place, you could stop and purchase animals for sacrifice. At each place, you had to have your money transferred from regular, everyday, normal money into temple money so that you could buy the right kind of animal. So there was a lot of movement before you ever came into a place of prayer and worship. And Jesus is railing against all of the commerce that has risen up, that has changed the temple from a house of prayer to a house of business. But as Solomon is building the house, the only thing on his mind is worship. The people who would come to worship, the study and teaching and training that would occur in the temple building. Now, again, 1 cubit is somewhere around 20 inches. So 60 cubits, somewhere around 100 feet. The size of the temple might be modest, but the inside was awe-inspiring. Some of you have a church building that would have been larger than the square footage of Solomon's temple, but none of you would have a building as opulent, as over the top, as luxurious as Solomon's temple. It was the grandeur of the accessories that set it over the top. And the inside of the temple was the most beautiful of any structure anywhere. Precious stones, gold, mosaics, carvings, all of this to honor God. So then the chronicler turns to the Holy of Holies. Why do we get information about the Holy of Holies? What is so special about this room in the temple? Well, this was a place that most people would never see. This was the resting place for God, not the dwelling place, just the resting place. And this was the motivation for the grandeur of Solomon's temple. This was probably a 30-foot box, 30 foot, 30 foot, 30 foot. It was completely overlaid with gold, floor to ceiling, and all of the walls gold. Even the nails that were used as fasteners were made of gold. This is the place for Solomon where the Ark of the Covenant, the 10 Commandments, would stay, and God would rest or dwell or sometimes be present. But as you came to temple, you expected God to be there, and God would be in this 30 by 30 by 30 by 30 box. This was not meant to confine or define God, just to provide a place of presence should God want a resting place. There was also a veil made of the bluest of blue cloth with gold threads within it, so that you could see where the box was. You just couldn't see what was inside the box. The high priest was the only person allowed to go in to the presence of God, much as Moses was the only person who was allowed face face interaction with God. The children of Israel would know the story of Moses. They would know the stories of Moses going up the mountain to see God, to worship with God, to talk with God. They would know that there was a place for God while they were on the Exodus, as well as now that they are established in Jerusalem. And if anyone wanted to know where God was, they would point to that box in the middle of the temple. They would point to that box with the blue and gold cloth surrounding the gold walls and know that's where God was. Most Israelites knew that God was with them. God had drawn near to them, but God was also set apart from them. And unless you were the high priest, you were restricted from direct interaction with God. And Jesus changed all of that. When Jesus was crucified, the veil of the temple was split, was torn, so that the box was now revealed for all to see clearly, so that all had access to God. One last piece of the temple, the pillars out front were made of bronze, and they were 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet tall, depending on how you measure. Those two pillars holding up the portico and the ceiling of the temple would have been monstrosities. And each pillar was named. Emblazoned on each pillar was the name of each. Yakin was one of them, Boaz was the other. Yakin, an early form of Yahweh, which means established by God. One pillar. As you look at the temple, you would see the name Yakin, meaning established by God. The other pillar was named Boaz, which translates strength. You will also remember Boaz to be the founding ancestor of the house of David. So to honor God and to honor the ancestor are these two pillars. And the words established by God and strength are on the pillars for all to see as they pass by. And whether they know what is happening in the temple or not, they know that it is a place that has been established by God and that offers strength. Perhaps the same is true for your church. Perhaps you have pillars, columns out on the front of your church. And as people pass by from the street, they look at those columns and see that your house has been built to honor God. Your church house has been built to honor God. But perhaps it goes even deeper. Perhaps it can be looked at by us as we look upon our own church buildings to know that it was established by God, and that as we come together, there is strength to be gained to establish and to strengthen our relationship with God and with one another. Jesus is now the cornerstone of the church. And Jesus came so that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Jesus came established by God to give strength to the people of God. Each time you look at your own church house, whether it be modest and humble or whether it be extravagant, remember that it is there for us to continue to establish our relationship with God and continue to gain strength as we come together in that house. Whether we use the sanctuary for our own prayer closet, or whether we use our sanctuary as the house of worship, God's presence is there with us, and the strength of God is there for us. And we should never forget that. We should never take advantage. We should never take the presence of that place for granted. Many people who have come before us have sacrificed. Many people who have come before us have worked hard. Many people who have come before us have contributed so that we might know that our church, your church, is established by God for the giving of strength to those who believe. Solomon went way over the top, living out the dreams of his father David, to give testimony to all who pass by that this temple is the greatest temple to honor the greatest God. As we look upon our church houses, we see that they too were established by God to give strength to all that might enter, and that they too have been built with sacrifice upon the shoulders of the saints who have come before us, so that we might give testimony to the greatest God as well. Let's pray together. God, whether our church house be over the top as Solomon's temple, or as modest as the widow's mite, we know that it is a place where you have established, a place where we can gain strength through our worship, through our prayers. God, fill us with purpose, fill us with joy, fill us with the energy for the living of these days, that we too might bring testimony of the greatest God, the creator of all of the heavens and all of the earth. For we pray in your name, O God. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Bo and the Beard, we'll be back next week. If it's Monday, it's going to be Monday school. Thanks for joining in. I'll see you next week.